Ravens on the backfields up in Owings Mills. And, of course, Luke will be there for all things and all of our coverage. Any breaking news will happen on our text service and, of course, out on Twitter and on social. Every minute is a new adventure, as it is for this guy, because the Olympics are now in session. He is a contributing editor at Vice Sports, and what they do over there is what I call old-fashioned journalism, and I love me some Viceland TV as well, and so does my wife. We sit around watching that half the time and investigate all the world's ills in some sort of real way with real questions being asked. Patrick Ruby has been there for a period of time now, also a sports and media fellow and former Georgetown professor, and you can follow his journey out on Twitter at Patrick_Ruby. That's HRUBY. And it's always a pleasure to have a real journalist on. Pat, what's going on? Happy summer, happy Olympics. It must be the doping and corruption season, right?
That's right. Happy summer to you. It's great to be here. And yeah, we just have a whole package here at Vice Sports about the sports war on doping, and that's also what I've written about. Kind of taking a second look at it, asking ourselves, much like, by the way, we are starting to ask ourselves in this society about the larger war on drugs. Are we winning or are we losing? Is this really worth doing, or should we consider a different approach? And given what we're seeing in the Olympics right now, with the huge scandal over in Russia, with the ongoing every Olympic scandal of doping, and let's be honest, plenty of other doping scandals in every other sport in the United States, these are important things to look at.
Well, let me say this. I know the wheels of our political process have clearly come off the cart here. I mean, obviously, right? And I live in Baltimore, and I know the police battle with citizens is also an issue we've lost sight of. Let me just say this, and maybe... And I try not to be cynical, dude. I just did a segment a little while ago, all positive thinking, and Tony Robbins and his new movie. So I am a positive guy by nature, but I tell you what, when it comes to dealing with what is a fact and what is fiction, the notion that the Russians built buildings in Sochi to pass urine through the walls to be able to have all of their athletes cheat seems so James Bond, so made up by American McCarthyism, and it sounds absurd, but then I think about it and I'm thinking, well, why the hell not? I mean, we have portrayed Putin in a certain light in this country, and this sort of plays right into that, and then you go through all of the corruption that leads to Olympics or World Cups being held in any of these dictatorships, and nothing shocks me because I've been to China as a visiting media member. I sort of know how it rolls. Well,
this is what you can look. Here's the thing: when it comes just to doping, right? And look, we could spend a whole other segment talking about corruption within international sports, how that ties into nationalism, how that ties to authoritarian, dictatorial countries. I mean, there's a lot there. But if we're just looking at doping, right? So what do we tend to see in countries that are authoritarian, that have a very powerful central government, that run a lot of their sports through their central government? We tend to see this kind of state-sponsored doping, whether it's the recent Russian scandal, whether you go back to the 70s and 80s, you look at East Germany, which has like the most systemic and probably ethical nightmare.
Well, as I've said, the chicks had beards there, for Christ's sake. I mean, come on,
right.
I mean,
there was a level of abuse to these drugs that we probably haven't seen much in sports before or since, that's compared to East Germany. But
there was Major League Baseball, but aside from that, right.
Right, well, we'll get to the idea because there's a difference between use and abuse, and we'll get to that in a second. But what you see in those countries is sort of state-sponsored. What you see in places like America and other countries where you don't have a central, sort of sports apparatus within the government, is you kind of see it go to the private sector, right? So what kind of scandals do we have in America? What happens with doping? You have it in a place like Balco out in the Bay Area, where you have a guy like Victor Conti, essentially, a one-man operation working with a few other people. You have the Biogenesis story, which is essentially an anti-aging clinic down in Florida, where some, Hollywood upstairs medical college doctor, handing out hormones to people like Alex Rodriguez. Time and time again, when you look, it's not that anyone who's an American here and says, yeah, you know what, of course the Russians are doping, of course these other countries dope, they have to do that to win because they're a bunch of cheaters who can't win otherwise. Don't be so sure that American athletes aren't doping either, or athletes from everywhere. At the elite levels of sport,
I mean, it's the story of our lifetime. I mean, I've been on the radio 25 years, right? I mean, Tom Boswell was a heretic when he said that Canseco and McGuire were juicing in the 80s, and then all of the baseball scandal that I was in the middle of. To this day, Brady Anderson will still tell you he never took any steroids. Most of the players will never admit to anything that they ever did, even though their foreheads grew by 3 sizes. And then you fast forward 20 years later, Lance Armstrong and the entire biking community is a joke. Baseball is by and large in the Hall of Fame is a joke at this point. You got Maria Sharapova getting a scarlet letter now in tennis. So,
this is the thing. If you go back historically, this is part of what I wrote about. We've always had doping in sports. We had in the ancient Greek Olympics, the athletes were chewing on raw testicles for a boost. Were they getting testosterone out of that? Maybe, I'm not sure. But they were doing that. Yeah, talk to historians. If you go back in our own modern Olympic history and our own modern sports history, you go back to the 1910s, the 1920s, the 1930s, Tour de France riders were taking nitroglycerin, the main ingredient in dynamite, as a stimulant. You had one of the Olympic marathon winners from America in the early 1900s. He was drinking strychnine, a.k.a. rat poison, also as a stimulant, and won the Olympic marathon. You go back to the 50s and 60s. You had Soviet and American weightlifters taking all kinds of steroids. In the early 1960s, the San Diego Chargers, they were the first American football team to have a systemic doping program. So none of this is new. I mean, this has always been a part of sports. What is newer is that in the 1960s and 1970s, the sports world, much like society at large, fell into a moral panic about drug use. Drugs became scary and dirty and bad. And just like under the Nixon administration and thereafter, we launched the war on drugs in this country, and now we're starting to see all the sort of negative impact of that. We also launched a sports war on drugs. This is when testing came in. Testing came in the late 60s. It expanded slowly in the 70s, much more in the 80s. In the late 80s, you saw, by the way, Joe Biden, people don't remember this, had congressional hearings in the late 80s that ended up taking steroids, which everyone should realize are medicine and have been regulated as such, and it put them onto the federal drug schedule alongside drugs like heroin. Even though the American Medical Association and the Drug Enforcement Agency told Congress, don't do this. These are not addictive drugs. This is not that kind of problem. Congress did anyway because they were morally panicking over this issue. And that gets us to where we are now. We're fighting this war in sports against performance-enhancing drugs. We're doing all this kinds of testing. It's very invasive. These athletes, they have something called the whereabouts rule. They have to report to the World Anti-Doping Agency and the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency and all these other agencies where they're going to be like 6 months in advance, day and night. They can be, a knock on the door at any time. Give me your blood. Give me your urine. As we've seen in some cases, like the Maria Sharapova case, sometimes these people are taking supplements that have something in it they didn't know. Sometimes they're taking drugs that weren't banned and are banned, even though there's no evidence they actually boost performance. It seems like we like to think it's very black and white, but actually it's extremely gray. And there's a lot of trampling on athletes' rights that goes on here, all because we have decided doping is so bad, we'd rather punish some innocent people than give up any chance of catching guilty people. But what I wrote about and what more people are starting to suggest, and these people are still heretics right now, I like the way you used that word earlier, is that maybe we have this all wrong. Maybe much like the bigger drug war, we're not actually solving a problem here, but we're making it worse, and that we might need to take a different approach to this.
Well, obviously, from any competitive standpoint, to take performance-enhancing drugs, I mean, that's what we call them PEDs now, right? I don't know the long-term effects. I don't know what it does to the elasticity of muscles or what it does to your heart or, whether it's going to shave 15 years off the life of Jose Canseco or Rafael Palmeiro or anyone else, Barry Bonds, Sammy Sosa. He changed colors for crying out loud. I don't know what that means, but I know in the short term when you're 28, weight and you do certain things, your muscles grow and you can hit baseballs, hit 50 home runs in a season instead of hitting 20. I know that you can do that, and I know that you could get a $100 million contract from doing that then. And I know now they say we're testing, and they're still banning players, and in the NFL and in baseball, and everyone screams, "I didn't do it." Everyone screams, "I got a bagged milkshake at the GNC,"
Right.
or whatever it is.
Right. Well, you have a right to be cynical there. Look, a lot of times people are doing it and they claim they're not. So everybody has a right to be cynical. But again, I'm saying, take a step back and ask yourself, what are we trying to accomplish here? So you bring up the first point you brought up, which is, I think, the most important point, which is the idea of these drugs can have detrimental effects to your health. We know this. Now, we don't know exactly how bad they can be, but here's something to keep in mind. Almost all the drugs we're talking about, and we're talking about PEDs, we're talking about anabolic steroids, we're talking about blood boosters like EPO, that we've seen that in cycling, which essentially gives you more stamina, increases the red blood cells in your system. We're talking about stimulants, amphetamines, for instance, which have been in baseball since the 1940s and which American fighter pilots still use to this day. We're talking about sort of these three general categories. And with all these drugs, the first thing to remember is, first and foremost, they're all medicine. They're all used in actual medicine. Steroids are used for AIDS patients to prevent muscle wasting. Amphetamines are sometimes used, like I said, in the military, they're used legitimately to keep pilots awake on bombing missions. These are drugs that, yes, they have side effects, but like all drugs, the drugs that all of us go to the pharmacy to get, they can also be used relatively safely under medical supervision. So how does that tie into the sports war on drugs? Well, what happens in sports when you have this prohibition is you push all the use underground. So if these athletes are out there still using, instead of using them responsibly and in theory much more safely under a doctor's care and supervision, they have to hide. They're hooking up with guys like Victor Conti, who I've reviewed before and I like, but Victor Conti isn't a medical doctor. He's a self-trained chemist who used to be a guitarist in Tower of Power. They end up with these sort of sketchy guru types, or these underground chemists. And sure, maybe some of them are doing a good job and doing right by the athletes, but who really knows?
Yeah, well, whatever Victor Conti was doing, it clearly worked, right?
Right. Yeah, that's for sure. But I'm saying from the health standpoint, and I think, as you said, we want to make sure we protect this. We want to keep these athletes from killing themselves. That's really important.
That's where the Players Association really let down their whole constituency in Major League Baseball by letting everybody become Len Dykstra. You get what you get at that point. I mean, Ken Caminiti's been dead a decade, man, right?
Right. And but the thing is, it's not steroids themselves that really have killed me. The one thing we do know is that with a lot of the drugs, again, the drugs that are older and more established, the ones, by the way, that they have the best tests for, like I said, they're medicines first and foremost. We generally know how to use them and how to avoid abusing them. And that's what we want to keep in mind, the difference between use and abuse. And if you were to, and this is what my story gets at, if you were to end this prohibition that we have right now and replace it with more of a medical model, you could, in theory, have much safer use of these substances. And that will be a benefit to athlete health. Now, there is another aspect of this, which is sort of the fan aspect, the competitive integrity aspect, the idea of, well, do these drugs somehow ruin the sport? Do they destroy the idea of a level playing field that we want to see or we want to have in sports? And again, that's a much more complicated question than it seems, because if you actually step back and look at it, there's really no level playing field in sports. There's all sorts of different advantages, whether it's financial, whether it's being born with great genes, whether it's having training advantages, the money to hire the best coaches, what kind of legal supplements can you use, all these sorts of things. Anyone who follows sports knows there really is no level playing field. I mean, there's not a level playing field in college football between Maryland and Alabama. Alabama puts a lot more into college football, a lot more money, and they get a lot more out of it. That's just how it is. And so, if you're thinking about just, if people are allowed to use PEDs, it will make things unfair. Well, not really. It'll make it no more unfair than it already is. It's just one more thing that will be part of the game. And by the way, already is part of the game. And that's sort of the third part of this argument, which is, are we actually accomplishing anything right now with our current testing system, our current system of policing and punishing? And this is something most fans don't realize. If you go look at WADA or USADA or MLB or the NFL or NCAA or even states where they drug test high school football players, you find consistently the rate of positive tests, and this is hundreds of thousands of tests done per year, is about 1% to 2%. Nobody thinks that the use of PEDs is only 1 to 2% among athletes, especially elite athletes. So what that tells you is testing isn't working. Athletes can already get around the test. Some of what they do, by the way, to get around the test is instead of using drugs, like I said, medicines and drugs that we know a lot about that can be used relatively safely, but we also know how to test for, they go use experimental drugs, crazy stuff, stuff that is still in FDA clinical trials or stuff that was rejected from clinical trials because it has really bad side effects.
Yes, stuff that was mixed up in a basement.
Yeah, all kinds of stuff like that. And they do that because they're trying to avoid the test. So that's kind of the thing. Testing is arguably making this less safe, but it also isn't catching anyone. And because it's not catching anyone, it's very hard to argue it's deterring anyone. And if it's not deterring anyone, what are we doing it for? And that's something that people are starting to ask. And I think everyone who thinks about this, everyone who cares about sports, needs to ask. And I want to say something else. This isn't black and white. I get the idea of, there's a potential harm here, so let's try to make sure it never happens. But unfortunately, we can't totally prevent this. We can't even do a very good job preventing this. So it would be more realistic to look at, well, how can we manage it? And that's when you're an adult, right, in the real world, a lot of problems aren't black and white. A lot of problems don't have a right answer and a wrong answer. They have two options, and one is less worse than the other, and you sort of have to pick the less worse one.
Just like our elections.
Right. If you're into politics, maybe you can.
Well, yeah, I guess it goes back to the Rush song, right? If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice, right?
Right. And so that's kind of the argument here. The argument is we should rethink this. We should redo this. We're never going to win this battle the way we're fighting it now. But we can have a better system. And another benefit, by the way, of this, getting to back to what we talked about with Russia, right? So what do you see in Russia? What you see is a state-sponsored system. You saw all this corruption, all kinds of bribes going on. You had Russian doping officials essentially soliciting bribes, from athletes to cover up positive tests. You had international track and field officials doing the same thing, right? We had another level of extortion. You wouldn't have any of this if doping didn't need to be kept secret. If it was all on the level and above board, where's the crime? There isn't any crime because there's nothing to hide. And so that's another thing. And if you look at bigger picture, look at our current war on drugs, or go back and look at alcohol prohibition in America. It didn't solve, and it hasn't solved, the problem of people abusing alcohol and abusing drugs. But what it does do is create a lucrative black market. It creates violent crime. It creates a bigger problem because it isn't above board. And in a small, that's also what you see in sports. You are creating scandals and corruption by doing this.
Patrick Ruby covers. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. So if you were to take a different approach, maybe you wouldn't have any of that. And maybe that would be a nice benefit.
Patrick Ruby is the contributing editor at Vice Sports. You can also follow his journey out on Twitter at Patrick_Ruby. That's HRUBY, also down at Georgetown as a professor there. All right, so for the Olympics and for everything that Real Sports did and their sort of takedown on the politics and how these games wind up in such corrupt places, this particular thing, and I know that sports and media are a big part of your thing here. You have NBC that says we're a news agency when it comes to news and wars and politics and business, but when it comes to the Olympics, we're a theater maker. We're simply producing a beautiful opening ceremony and showing you that how wonderful Michael Phelps looks in the pool, and all of this stuff is going on down there that many journalists are going to cover because Brazil Brazil isn't China. Brazil isn't Sochi. I
Right.
get the vibe that anybody that's down there that sees the urine and the feces flooding into the water that these athletes are getting into, anyone that's living in an Olympic village with no running water and no sewage system, the food, the water, the air, the Zika, I have a feeling the free world will be covering this quite freely over the next couple of weeks, and it's not going to smell real good.
I think you're right. And I think when you look at this, there's a couple of sort of sub issues here. I mean, first of all, the idea of like how will NBC cover it? Well, I'm sure NBC will touch on all this stuff. They're not going to completely ignore it. It would be embarrassing for them just to ignore it. But of course, they won't make it the emphasis of their coverage. And in their defense, they probably should. They paid a lot of money to put on this reality show we call the Olympics for two to 3 weeks. And frankly, most people that are tuning in, that's what they're tuning in for. They're not necessarily tuning in for all the bad, hard news around it.
They don't know how many people died making these stadiums and 800,000 people that have been relocated to make room for these stadiums and were thrown out with police guards and batons and women were bloodied and children were beaten. Yeah, we don't want to get into that part of it.
No, and look, I mean, I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying that's typical. That's typical of sports around. That's typical of previous Olympics, typical.
Hey, that's typical of the Orioles. I mean, I've reported on the truths of the Orioles the last 25 years. I had my press credential taken away 10 years ago for simply reporting facts. So that's the way totalitarianism works, I think, right?
It's true at a smaller level when you are a media company that's paying for the rights to something. You're paying for the rights to the entertainment product. And so it makes sense. I'm not saying it's totally right, but it makes sense. And like your other point is very valid, which is a lot of other press down there. And if you are interested in all these things, you don't have to look far to find them. They're being well covered. So kudos to my own industry for that.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
But beyond that, I mean, I do think one of the interesting things this does speak to, and what we're seeing with the Olympics in particular, is they've become so expensive. And, out of that, they do foster so much petty corruption. Just sort of in terms of bidding, in terms of winning the bids, in terms of the actual construction. They leave behind a legacy of debt everywhere they go. We're seeing this now. We're getting to the point where not a lot of cities and countries and places are bidding for these games anymore because it's simply doesn't make sense. Unless you're like an authoritarian country that is still taking with the idea of like, this is my chance to show off to the world. I don't care how much money I spend or how much damage it causes to my own country. Unless you're that kind of place, it's become a very unattractive prospect. We're a long way away from the 1984 Olympics that were in LA that actually turned a small profit. That's about the last time the Olympics didn't leave sort of a tough legacy, if nothing else, for local taxpayers. And that's the mildest part of it.
Well, they went back in the Real Sports piece and showed what the Athens Olympics left behind, which are a bunch of baseball stadiums and field hockey stadiums that were built that are now overrun with weeds. Same thing's going on in Sochi. They're spending $75 million to sweep the floors of an arena that hasn't been used in 2 years.
They leave these giant white elephants. It's not a good deal. And that makes sense. If you didn't have an infrastructure in place in the first place, your local area, your city, your municipality, even your country probably didn't need it. That's why you didn't already have
What are they going to do with these 20 soccer stadiums in Qatar?
Exactly. No, I have no idea. They're going to turn to ovens probably at some point if the power ever goes out. But I mean, that's the thing is, I think what we will probably see in the future eventually is if enough places just say, you know what, we're not bidding for this, or we're not bidding for this in a way where we're building a bunch of new stuff. You're going to come to our city and you're going to use what we have. That's probably more the future of these sports mega events. And some people have suggested this. I think this is an amazing idea, but it will never happen until the International Olympic Committee can't make any more money doing it the way it now does it. Put the Olympics in one place, or maybe 2 or 3 places and rotate it. And that's it. You have permanent home for the Winter Games and for the Summer Games. You build the facilities, you maintain them there, you create some sort of museum. You can hold off-year events there too, like World Championships. And instead of having places spend all this money to build stuff that becomes instantly obsolete after 3 weeks and, puts their public coffers in debt for decades, you do it this way. I think eventually we will get there, but it will only be when the IOC can't milk any more dollars or yen or rubles or whatever currency you want out of the rest of the world. But the rest of the world is starting to realize this doesn't work, and I do think it will happen.
Patrick Ruby covering all things journalism, sports, and where the world collides at Vice Sports, as well as, of course, out on his Twitter feed at Patrick_Ruby. That's HRUBY. He is a contributing editor there, as well as a former Georgetown professor. Always great to have you on, Patrick. You always raise the bar for conversation here. Enjoy the games. We'll get back together and discuss some of the more of the world's ills sometime soon, right?
That's all I ever talk about, so I'm happy to do it.
Peace, man. There he goes, Patrick Ruby at Vice Sports and on Twitter. You can find me in the Buy a Toyota Audio Vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. We come in crystal clear from wherever you are. Big reminder, Tuesday night we have head coach Brian Billick joining us August 9th at Greenmount Station in Hampstead and Carroll County. We're coming back up north again. It allows me to pick up some fruits and vegetables on the road on the way back as well as those delicious crab cakes at Greenmount Station. Crab cakes, beer, food. We're going to grab some dessert. I think my wife's going to be with us as well. Come on out, say hello. We'll be swabbing for the Bone Marrow Registry and for There Goes My Hero with Brian Billick, our partner on behalf of the Living Classrooms Foundation, Tuesday night, Greenmount Station in Hampstead. Anything you miss here, you find in the Buy a Toyota Audio Vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world. And, of course, our morning newspaper at 7 a.m. hits your email inbox free of charge and powered up by Planet Fitness. Breaking news, that happens first on the WNST Tech Service, and that is brought to you by our friends at Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. I'm Nestor. This is WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports. And WN. First place, Baltimore Orioles, and of course, headed off to Chicago and the Bay Area all next week. And we got the Ravens on the backfield beating each other up in Owings Mills. Luke Jones will be on the scene in Owings